I didn't plan to kiss him. It just happened. Right there in the parking lot behind the grocery store, where the asphalt still held the morning heat and the air smelled faintly of gasoline and baked bread. We had barely spoken during the drive. A few words about traffic. Some joke about the price of eggs. But when we closed the trunk, our hands brushed. Just a flick, and I looked up. He was already watching me. There was a beat. Then another. And I didn't look away. The kiss wasn't deep. It wasn't even long. Just the soft, unexpected press of his lips on mine, like a question neither of us knew how to answer. My heart knocked so hard I thought it would echo off the windshield. I stepped back first, mouth dry, palms cold. "We should go," I said, though my voice didn't sound like mine. Back home, I unpacked groceries like nothing had happened. Lettuce, milk, the same cereal we always bought. But my fingers trembled. That kiss had no fireworks. No music. Just 1 second. 1 second that burned through everything I thought I still believed about myself. The next morning, I moved through the house with careful purpose, folding laundry, stirring oatmeal, pretending I hadn't felt that kiss, like a wire pulled tight beneath my skin. Jason joined us for dinner, sitting across from me with that same quiet focus, and when our eyes met, there was no mistaking it. He remembered too. Tom barely looked up from his phone, murmuring about deadlines and some neighbor's renovation, and I realized with a jolt that he hadn't really looked at me in weeks, maybe months. That bothered me more than it should have. I found myself adjusting my sweater's neckline in the hallway mirror, smoothing my hair, adding a touch of color to my lips before dinner, not for my husband but for someone else entirely. Later, while sorting clean clothes into drawers, I found an old nightgown, silk pale blue, and held it, wondering why I kept something meant to be seen when no one had looked in years. Saturday morning, I stepped out of the shower wrapped in a towel, steam still clinging to my skin, and turned the corner into the hallway. And there he was, Jason, standing with a mug in his hand, frozen mid-step, his eyes locking onto mine before either of us had a chance to pretend it was nothing. For a split second, neither of us moved, the silence between us thick enough to press against, and when he finally spoke, just one word, "Sorry," his eyes never left me, and that was the moment I knew I didn't want him to. I should have clutched the towel tighter, said something, anything, but instead I stood there, heartbeat in my throat, and watched him pass by with his gaze lingering longer than it should have. That night I lay in bed, staring at the ceiling, hearing every breath, every creak of the house, knowing deep down, this wasn't just a moment. This was the beginning. Tom suggested we take a drive to the lake, just the two of us, something he called quality time, and I agreed, hoping maybe fresh air could stir something we'd forgotten how to feel. The scenery passed in silence, the kind that used to feel easy but now felt too loud, and when we parked and walked along the water, I brought up us, what we'd become, how quiet things had gotten. He shrugged, barely meeting my eyes, saying, "Everyone gets tired, it's normal," as if that explained away the distance stretching between us like fog. I stopped trying after that, letting the ride home drift by like background noise, his hand resting near mine but never reaching. Back at the house, Jason was in the yard trimming hedges, dirt on his hands, sunlight on his arms, and we started talking about tomatoes, summer heat, old cars, and yet it felt more connected than every word I'd spoken to Tom that day. That night, I touched Tom first, hoping maybe my body would remember what it was supposed to feel, that something familiar might awaken whatever had been sleeping in me for years. But as his hands moved over me, all I felt was absence, like touching a photograph of warmth instead of the real thing. I tried to stay present, to respond, to convince myself that love didn't need spark to be real, but my skin stayed quiet, and afterward I lay there staring at the ceiling, empty in a way that scared me. At dawn, I laced up old sneakers and ran for the first time in 5 years, legs burning, lungs tight, needing pain to feel alive again. On my way back, flushed and sweating, I saw Jason fixing the neighbor's fence, shirt damp, hands rough, and when he looked up and saw me, his eyes didn't just follow. They burned, and for the first time in years I felt seen. I met my oldest friend for lunch at the cafe where we used to bring our toddlers, and now we sit across from each other like women who remember who they were but aren't sure how to say it out loud anymore. She vented about her husband's new job, the late nights, the silence between them, and I listened, nodding in all the right places, biting my tongue as the words gathered behind my teeth like rising water. When she asked how I was, I opened my mouth, ready to spill something real, something trembling and raw. But instead I smiled and said, "I'm just tired," and she nodded like she believed it. That evening, after the dishes were done and the house went still, my phone buzzed. One message from Jason, "You looked like sunlight today." I didn't reply. But I read it again. And again. 7 times. Each time slower than the last, like maybe reading it right could make it less dangerous. Nick showed up Friday evening with his duffel bag slung over one shoulder and that same boyish grin I hadn't seen in months, pulling me into a hug that smelled like gym clothes and cologne. And for a moment I felt whole again, like a mother with purpose, like the world had snapped back into place. The house filled with his laughter, the slam of cabinets, the thud of music leaking from his headphones, and everything felt lighter, less haunted. But then Jason stopped by, casual as ever, asking about tools he'd loaned, and when I answered the door, Nick at my side, I saw the way Jason looked at me, brief but loaded, and worse, I felt how I looked back. That evening, after everyone was asleep, I stood in the dark kitchen, forehead pressed against the glass, heart pacing, whispering to myself, if Nick ever knew, if he saw what I feel, he'd never forgive me. I heard the drawer open before I saw him holding it. My old phone, the one I hadn't touched in over a year. And as Tom pressed the button and the screen flickered to life, I watched the stillness settle into his face like a shadow pulling tight. He didn't ask, didn't accuse, didn't even look up, but the silence that followed was colder than any scream, stretching across the house like a sheet of ice, numbing everything in its path. I tried to speak during dinner, tried to reach him with small talk about the weather, the garden, anything ordinary, but his responses were clipped, polite, distant in that terrifying way that says, I know without needing proof. That evening, when the doorbell rang, I already knew it was Jason, standing there with guilt in his eyes and heat in his voice, saying, I need to see you, and I whispered back, everything's different now, and still, I let him in. We sat in the garden as the sun dropped behind the fence, casting long shadows across the dry grass, and though Jason and I didn't touch, didn't speak of the kiss or the message or the door I opened, the air between us pulsed like something alive, something we were both pretending not to feel. I stared at the weeds growing through the bricks and said quietly, I don't know who I am anymore. And he didn't flinch, just looked at me like he already understood, replying, You're not lost, you just woke up. His voice was steady, calm, not pleading, and when I told him to leave, when I whispered, Go, he nodded once and walked through the side gate, slow and silent, but I knew before he even reached the sidewalk, this wasn't over. That night, Tom stood in the bedroom doorway and asked, not accusing, not begging, just simply, Do you want to leave me? And I said nothing at all. The house was quiet when I stepped into the bathroom, the kind of quiet that doesn't comfort but hums beneath your skin, and as I caught my reflection in the mirror, something unfamiliar stared back. Eyes brighter, sharper, mouth softer, like a version of me that had been buried under routine and silence and now refused to disappear. I wasn't with Jason, hadn't run off or confessed or followed some reckless instinct, and I hadn't left Tom either. We still shared meals, exchanged pleasantries, pretended the foundation was whole, but I was no longer the woman who sleepwalked through her days. I had changed, not loudly or with drama, but in the slow, irreversible way a shoreline changes after years of quiet waves. When my phone lit up on the counter, Jason's name glowed like a question I already knew the answer to. I didn't pick it up. I didn't delete it. I just looked at it and breathed like I hadn't in years.